The prolonged and brutal conflict between the Apache and Comanche stands as one of the most significant in Native American history. As sworn adversaries, they engaged in what the Spanish in Mexico referred to as a War of Extermination. By the late 1500s, the Eastern Apache had established a formidable presence in the southern Great Plains, securing prime buffalo hunting grounds and agricultural space, thus enjoying the benefits of both lifestyles. This semi-agrarian way of life enriched their diets while placing them adjacent to North America's most vital food source. Conversely, the Comanche found themselves marginalized, driven into less favorable territories by more dominant groups like the Apache, which fostered a culture marked by aggression and vengeance. However, a pivotal change in the mid-1600s, instigated by their greatest adversary, would propel them to become the most powerful native group in American history. The Spanish, having achieved success in Mexico during the 1500s, harbored ambitions of further conquest, gradually moving northward to colonize and extend their influence until they encroached upon Apache lands. The Spanish conquest was a calculated endeavor, bringing with them metal armor, firearms, and numerous horses as they advanced into what is now New Mexico around 1600. With their overwhelming might, they swiftly subdued many native groups in the area, compelling them to adopt Christianity and labor for their benefit, mirroring their actions in Central and South America over the preceding century. However, the Apache were less compliant, launching violent raids on the new Spanish settlements and seizing horses in the process. Observing the Spanish from a distance, they learned to ride, and by the 1650s, the Apache were executing mounted raids on horseback, enhancing their speed and effectiveness as adversaries. The relentless harassment proved to be more than the Spanish in the region could endure. Spanish settlements such as Taos and Santa Fe frequently faced attacks, and the Pueblo Indians, who had been subjugated by the Spanish, became the unfortunate victims of Apache aggression. As subjects of Spain, the Pueblo anticipated protection. However, the Spanish were unable to offer effective defense. Although the raids were brief, they were devastating, with the Apache killing anyone who resisted and swiftly vanishing into the western terrain with numerous horses and supplies. By 1680, the relentless Apache assaults led the Pueblo to lose faith in Spanish protection, prompting them to revolt and expel the Spanish from New Mexico, resulting in the escape of thousands of Spanish horses. Mustangs, a breed well adapted to the Great Plains, would find their way north. Fast forward a few decades, as territories changed hands, the Spanish continued to endure frequent Apache raids. However, in 1706, a notable shift occurred. The Spanish observed a sudden cessation of these attacks. Reports began to surface that the Spanish could not comprehend, indicating unusual behavior among the Apache. Groups such as the J. Carrilla and the Mescaleros appeared to be hastily abandoning their plain settlements and farms. The Spanish heard whispers of significant battles but were unaware of the identity of the Apache's adversaries. They learned of invaders from the north, mounted on horseback, described as powerful, swift, and perilous. By the 1720s, the Apache were so severely impacted that many groups retreated into the mountains or sought refuge with the Spanish. Some bands, however, did not survive the journey. Spanish expeditions discovered that plains-dwelling Apache groups like the Furones, Carlones, and Palomas had completely vanished, exterminated by an unidentified enemy. The source of the Apache's demise was revealed by the Utes. The northern phantom invaders were referred to as the Comanche, which translates in their language to those who are perpetually opposed to me. This interpretation aptly describes a group that the Spanish would later identify as the Comanche. Historically, the Comanche have often been portrayed as relatively unimpressive, having faced bullying from other tribes in the area, including the Apache. They were forced to migrate to the eastern side of the Rockies, where they struggled to survive in the least favorable territories. However, their fortunes changed dramatically in the mid-17th century with the arrival of horses, a gift that transformed their way of life. These horses, mustangs freed during Apache raids on the Pueblo in Spanish territories, revolutionized their existence. The mustangs were perfectly adapted to the plains, and within 2 decades following the Spanish withdrawal from New Mexico, the phenomenon known as the Great Horse Dispersal occurred, with all regional tribes adopting horses. Yet the Comanche excelled in this new era. They distinguished themselves by learning to breed horses, unlike other tribes that relied on raiding for their mounts. For the Comanche, horses became a form of currency, leading to their wealth. In contrast, the Eastern Apache and many other plains tribes engaged in semi-agricultural practices, which tethered them to specific lands. The Comanche, however, embraced a nomadic lifestyle, allowing them to traverse vast distances across the plains, a feat made possible by their horses. This mobility rendered them a formidable threat to anyone within a 400-mile radius. As skilled buffalo hunters, their extensive range was invaluable, and as warriors they instilled fear in their adversaries. Most of their raids occurred in the spring and summer months when the plains were lush with grass, ensuring ample sustenance for their horses, and they often executed these movements under the cover of night. The illumination provided by the full moon cast a glow over the plains, granting visibility for both offensive and defensive maneuvers. The raids were merciless, characterized by killings, tortures, and other atrocities that I hesitate to mention in a public forum. Such violence was so prevalent that settlers came to label these circumstances as the Comanche Moon. The Comanche's primary advantage, which set them apart from other tribes, was their ability to fight entirely mounted, a rarity among Native American tribes. George Catlin, the artist who captured this scene, observed the Comanche people firsthand. He noted, "On foot, they are one of the most unattractive and slovenly races of Indians I have ever encountered. However, once they are on horseback, they undergo a remarkable transformation. I am unequivocally prepared to declare the Comanches as the most exceptional horsemen I have encountered in all my travels. They mastered the skill of shooting arrows with precision while riding, targeting both enemies and buffalo. They would protect themselves from adversaries by leaning off the sides of their horses while accurately shooting from beneath the neck. In contrast, the Apache utilized horses primarily for travel, dismounting to engage in combat. On foot, they were formidable opponents, equally as ruthless as the Comanche. If they managed to confront the Comanche without their horses, they might have gained an upper hand at times. The Comanche were inseparable from their horses, making them elusive. On the warpath, they never camped in the same location twice. The Apache, however, were more predictable due to their agricultural lifestyle, and their combat techniques had become outdated. T.R. Fehrenbach aptly summarized this in his book, Comanches, A History of a People, stating, "It was this very craving for corn that led to their downfall when their territory was invaded by true savages on horseback." The Comanche were more ruthless towards the Apache, but their ultimate goal was not annihilation. They sought resources, particularly the buffalo's grazing grounds. Previously, it was noted that the Comanche held on to memories of their treatment during times of weakness, which fostered a sense of vengeance and aggression towards their adversaries. According to Thomas Britton's book, Light Pan Apaches, the Comanche's objective remained consistent: to ambush the Apache at their rancherias with sudden assaults, aiming to kill as many as possible, capture women and children for the New Mexico slave trade, and pillage the rancherias, destroying huts and crops. This prolonged conflict between the two formidable groups has largely faded from historical records, with even the Spanish observing from afar. However, it is evident that the brutality of the war solidified the Comanche's enmity towards all Apaches. The documented outcomes narrate the tale, revealing that the Light Pan were among the last Apache tribes on the plains. By the 1720s, the Mescaleros and Jacarillas had retreated, and in 1723, a significant conflict known as El Gran Sierra del Ferrero unfolded. This event involved a substantial Comanche assault on the Light Pan that lasted several days, resulting in numerous Light Pan casualties and the capture of many women and children. Like other Apache groups, the Light Pan were compelled to withdraw to the mountains and deserts, caught between the overwhelming Comanche force to the north and the hostile Spanish to the south. Consequently, the Apache were prompted to devise a new strategy. In 1749, an unexpected development occurred when the Apache approached San Antonio, seeking a peace treaty with the Spanish, who were relieved given the continuous raids since the city's establishment in 1719, which included kidnappings and murders, alongside the theft of thousands of horses and supplies. The Apache's request for peace was a significant relief for the Spanish. The increase in raids occurred simultaneously with the Comanche expelling them from their lands. The plains provided greater sustenance and resources compared to the mountains and deserts they had been compelled to inhabit. The Apache sought not only peace, but also requested the Spanish to establish a mission and presidio within their territory to facilitate their conversion to Christianity, a notion they had previously hesitated to embrace. The Spanish priests eagerly seized this opportunity. Although it took a few years for approval, this initiative would address multiple concerns for the Spanish. It could potentially end Apache raids permanently and allow for their conversion to Catholicism, thereby saving their souls. While there were whispers of gold and silver deposits in the vicinity, it is likely that this had no bearing on their decision. Sites for the mission were surveyed, and it was determined that the mission and presidio would be constructed at a location known as San Saba. Financial backing was provided by a wealthy Spaniard who requested that his brother, Father Alonso Giraldo de Toreros, manage the mission. A skilled and seasoned Spanish officer, Don Diego Ortiz de Parilla, was appointed to oversee the project. In April 1757, the Spanish assembled their supplies, a handful of priests, 100 soldiers, and approximately 2,000 animals for the endeavor. However, upon their departure, the Apache were conspicuously absent. Upon reaching San Saba, the Apache were still nowhere to be seen. Nevertheless, the mission and presidio were erected about 2 miles apart, both fortified by a substantial wooden palisade. Occasionally, the Apache would visit the mission, requesting gifts and assuring the Spanish of their imminent relocation. However, after several months of inaction, the Spanish grew increasingly exasperated. Certain priests suspected that the entire situation was merely a ruse, believing that the Apache were primarily interested in acquiring gifts. However, the true motive behind their actions was revealed in March when the Spanish discovered that San Saba was not within Apache territory, but rather Comanche land, and that the Apache were instigating conflict. It became evident that the Apache had been moving northward to launch raids against the Comanche, during which they spread false information about a fort established in San Saba. To further incite the Comanche, the Apache left behind Spanish tools and footwear in their camps, suggesting a Spanish alliance. By early March to 1758, as spring grasses began to sprout and the full moon illuminated the plains, the Spanish observed that all Apache presence around San Saba had vanished. With the dawn, they heard war cries from beyond their fortifications and discovered that over 60 of their horses were missing. A reconnaissance team of 15 soldiers returned hastily, reporting that the hills were teeming with adversaries. For nearly 2 weeks, the Comanche maintained their distance while the presidio went into lockdown, with most refusing to venture outside its walls. Father Toreros and approximately 30 others remained at the mission, situated 2 miles from the presidio. On March 16th, the Comanche arrived at the gates of both locations. As the Spanish peered over the palisade, they were filled with astonishment at the sight before them. Fehrenbach notes that, at the mission, the Comanche initially pretended to be friendly, and the priests allowed them entry, accompanied by several other native tribes with whom the Spanish had previously established peaceful relations. Upon entering the gates, the Spanish attempted to placate the Comanche with offerings. However, this quickly escalated into a massacre. Reports vary, but it is estimated that the Comanche killed between 8 and 10 individuals during the mission, including Father Toreros. They proceeded to incinerate the structures and desecrate the corpses of the deceased. While looting the goods, several individuals managed to flee to the more fortified presidio. It appears that the Comanche prioritized plundering over pursuing the missionaries, who posed no threat to them. Parilla endeavored to bolster the mission's defenses, yet the soldiers he dispatched were swiftly attacked and compelled to retreat. The Comanche refrained from assaulting the presidio, demonstrating their strategic acumen. They had the upper hand against the mission and had made their statement. 2 days later, they vanished as abruptly as they had arrived. The immediate consequences of the San Saba massacre worsened for the Spanish. The following year, in 1759, they launched a punitive expedition aimed at avenging the Comanche. This operation was led by Parilla. However, it did not yield favorable results. The Spanish advanced northward and indiscriminately killed numerous Tonkawa simply because they were present. Hay later confronted the Comanche at the Red River in October, but the Comanche were well prepared. There was no entering their territory without their awareness, nor could one locate them without their consent. Their numbers were formidable, with the Spanish fielding approximately 1,000 personnel, while the Comanche boasted at least double that. This sight instilled terror in the Spanish ranks, although they were initially somewhat organized. The 130 Apache accompanying them, along with other Indian auxiliaries, were acutely aware of the Comanche's capabilities and were not seeking a confrontation of this nature. Parilla attempted to maintain cohesion within the expedition, but many individuals fled as the battle commenced, resulting in a panic-driven retreat with minimal engagement. They even abandoned their supplies, including cannons. What was meant to demonstrate strength ultimately resulted in a significant embarrassment. The Apache's strategy to establish a buffer of Spanish against the Comanche was a complete failure. It seemed that the Spanish were also unable to withstand the Comanche, and the situation was about to deteriorate further for the Apache. In a few years, the Comanche advanced southward, frequently raiding the Spanish borderlands. The Spanish settlements were dispersed across a dry landscape, which served as a convenient route for the Comanche. They easily evaded the forts, which were the only real threats they acknowledged. The harshness of the era is vividly depicted by S.C. Nguyen in his book, Empire of the Summer Moon. He notes that the Comanche never attacked a fortified position. They thrived on surprise and sought tactical superiority, launching assaults on entire villages, burning them, and inflicting torture and death upon the residents, leaving young women with their insides mutilated and men set ablaze. Infants were impaled, and young boys and girls were taken captive. They then utilized the speed of the Spanish Mustangs to escape, leaving the heavily equipped dragoons to pursue them at a slow pace. Any efforts by the Spanish to retaliate typically ended in disappointment. Like the Apache, the Spanish struggled to locate the Comanche. Occasionally, punitive expeditions were dispatched against them, some returning empty-handed, while others did not return at all, victims of either the Comanche or the unforgiving plains. History may never fully understand the reasons behind their disappearance. Now it was the Spanish who required a new approach, and the Apache would compel them to devise one. Following the San Saba disaster, the Apache resumed their raids against the Spanish. Their actions were not solely driven by malice. Having been entirely displaced from the plains by the Comanche, they found themselves unable to cultivate crops and in need of resources. In 1780, Texas Governor Domingo Cabello reported from San Antonio stating, "There is no moment, day or night, when reports of atrocities and disturbances do not arrive from the ranches." Completely vulnerable as we are, this situation can only lead to the total devastation and loss of this province. The Spanish began to contemplate a strategy they had never considered before: a war of extermination. They found themselves under attack from two formidable powers at the same time. Despite the fact that these powers were adversaries, the Spanish aimed to exploit this rivalry. Until nearly 1780, their attempts to communicate with the Comanche had largely been unsuccessful. However, this changed when an officer named Don Juan Batista de Anza gained some respect. He led an expedition into Comancheria, employing mounted tactics similar to those of the Comanche, and successfully ambushed a group they caught off guard near Greenhorn Peak. The Comanche displayed a degree of arrogance, having previously underestimated the Spanish military capabilities. Anza capitalized on his initial success with further assaults in the following years. After capturing individuals during his raids, he would release them with a message indicating that the Comanche could choose peace and trade at their discretion. By 1785, while the Comanche had not suffered catastrophic losses, the toll was significant enough to prompt them to engage in discussions. Several bands sent representatives to a meeting in Taos, where, through Anza's diplomatic skill, they agreed to appoint a single spokesperson. At the conclusion of the meeting, they reached three agreements. 1. The Comanche would cease hostilities against the Spanish. 2. Trade relations would be established between the Spanish and the Comanche. 3. The Comanche would assist the Spanish in eliminating the Apache. This represented a substantial triumph for the Spanish, as it not only halted conflicts with the Comanche, but also set the stage for the systematic eradication of their long-standing adversary in the region. The Comanche readily consented to this arrangement. A notable instance of the Spanish-Comanche campaigns occurred in January 1790, when Spanish General Juan de Ugalde commanded a formidable force of Spanish Comanche against the Lipan Apache in Wichita. Hundreds of warriors were ensnared in a canyon west of San Antonio and were subsequently slaughtered. Following this defeat, the Lipan Apache were reduced to fewer than 1,000 warriors. Like other Apache groups, they vacated their remaining territories on the outskirts of Comancheria and retreated entirely into the mountains, this time permanently. As the most dominant tribe in North America, the Comanche had solidified their control over the plains, and for a period, the Spanish no longer regarded the Apache as a significant threat to their settlements. The peace established between the Spanish and the Comanche endured for several decades. However, the Apache demonstrated remarkable resilience. While the Comanche triumphed on the plains, the challenging terrain of the mountains diminished the advantage of their horses. In such an environment, the Apache were able to mount a successful resistance. Indeed, both the Spanish and Comanche civilizations would eventually succumb to them. But those narratives are reserved for another occasion. Thank you for watching the video. I trust you found it enjoyable and will return to explore more content on the channel. Should you have any questions, comments, or suggestions for future videos, please feel free to share them, and we will endeavor to address all inquiries.